My name is Nora Caldwell. I was 34 years old that Thursday morning, living in a second-floor apartment on Fenner Street in Harwick, Ohio, 11 minutes from the house I grew up in. I worked as a medical billing coordinator. Not a glamorous job, not a title that impressed anyone at family gatherings, but it paid steadily and it let me keep a flexible schedule, which mattered more than anyone outside our house ever understood. My father's name was Gerald. He was 68. He had a heart condition that had been managed for 6 years without incident, a mild tremor in his left hand that had appeared after my mother died, and an almost religious commitment to his morning coffee ritual. He was not dead. He was, at that moment, watching the speaker icon on my phone with an expression I can only describe as calm. Gerald Caldwell was the kind of man who kept receipts in labeled envelopes. He reread the same 3 Louis L'Amour novels on a rotating cycle. He had never in his life raised his voice at either of his daughters, and when something hurt him, he went quiet in a specific way. Not sullen, just inward, like a door closing slowly rather than slamming. On the shelf above his kitchen desk he kept a red 3-ring binder, its spine labeled House in black permanent marker. I had seen it there for as long as I could remember. I had never asked what was in it. Renata was 3 years older than me. She had married Marcus Holloway 6 years earlier, and the wedding had been the last occasion I could point to where the 4 of us had occupied the same room without some invisible current running underneath everything. Marcus worked in commercial real estate. He had a way of entering a house and looking at the walls before he looked at the people in it. What I contributed to my father's daily life over the 4 years before that phone call was not something I kept a log of. That is not how it worked. It was not something I tracked or reported or discussed at family dinners, partly because Renata stopped coming to family dinners, and partly because that is not what you do when someone is your father and he needs things. I drove him to his cardiologist at Harwick Regional every 6 weeks. I sat in the waiting room and read the same 3 outdated magazines because the new ones were always taken. I drove him home. We stopped at Crestline Diner when he felt well enough, and he always ordered the same thing. Eggs over easy, wheat toast, no butter, and we talked about the garden he no longer had the energy to maintain, and whether the robin that came to his yard every March was actually the same bird or just looked the same. When his prescription routine changed, 3 times in 4 years, each time requiring a new adjustment period, I was the one who called the pharmacy, who talked to the nurse line, who kept a running note in my phone of which pill was which color and what time it was taken. Not because anyone assigned this to me. Because I was there. I took 1 week of unpaid leave from work during the winter of his 2nd year of managed care, when he had a sustained run of bad days that scared both of us without producing anything a doctor could officially diagnose. I slept on his couch. I made soup he mostly didn't eat. I watched old westerns with him until he fell asleep in his chair, and I could confirm, by watching the rise and fall of his chest, that he was fine. Renata called during that week twice. Once to ask if the doctor had said anything new. Once to say that Marcus thought maybe Dad should consider a facility. My father heard that second call. He didn't say anything about it. He just went quiet in the way he did, the door closing slowly, and then asked if I wanted more tea. I said yes. I made the tea. During that week I also rescheduled 2 of my own work deadlines, managed the pharmacy when a prior authorization lapsed on his beta blocker, and drove him to a follow-up at Harwick Regional that turned out to be nothing. His blood pressure had spiked from disrupted sleep, the cardiologist told us, and would settle once his routine did. Dad nodded. He thanked the doctor. On the way home he asked if I wanted to stop at Crestline, and I said yes, and we did, and he ordered eggs over easy and wheat toast with no butter, and told me a story about the first winter he and my mother had spent in the Harwick house, when the furnace quit in January and they heated the kitchen with a camp stove and called it camping. He laughed at his own story. I let him. That was its own kind of labor, knowing when to let a person feel capable of their own history. It's Dad. Those 2 words landed differently depending on where you were standing. I was standing close enough to watch them land on Renata through the phone, which I knew because the practiced flatness in her voice broke at the edge, not into grief, not into guilt exactly, but into something that sounded like a system encountering input it had not prepared for. Dad. A pause. What are you doing there? Having coffee with your sister, he said. Same as most Thursdays. Another pause, longer. Then Marcus's voice, lower now, less certain. Gerald, Renata was just. I heard what Renata was just, my father said. I had never heard him use that construction before. I had never heard him cut a sentence off that way. His hands were flat on the table in front of him, and the chipped coffee mug was pushed to the side, and he was looking at the phone the way he looked at things he intended to deal with completely. Marcus laughed, my father said. I heard that too. No one on the other end spoke. Let me ask you something, Renata, he said. Where did you get the idea that I died last night? We thought. Her voice shifted again. The practiced tone was gone entirely now. What replaced it was something smaller. Someone told Marcus that you'd been taken to the hospital. Who told Marcus that? Silence. I've been sitting in my daughter's kitchen since 7 o'clock this morning, my father said. I have not been to any hospital. My heart is fine. My coffee is getting cold. I heard Renata make a sound that wasn't a word. Here is what I want you to think about, Dad said, and his voice was still level, still quiet, the way it had always been quiet. You called your sister at 7:30 in the morning. You told her I was dead. And then your husband laughed. He let that sit for a moment. That's what I want you to think about. He reached over and ended the call himself. He pushed the phone back toward me. He picked up his coffee mug. Both hands around it again and looked out at the window where the robin had gone. My phone began vibrating within 4 minutes. Renata. Then Marcus from his own number. Then a text from my Aunt Carol, my father's sister, that said, Nora, what is going on? Renata says there's been a terrible misunderstanding and you're the one who started it. I set the phone face down on the table. My father looked at it and then looked away. My cousin Diane added to the family group chat. Just want to make sure everyone takes a breath before things get out of hand. I picked the phone back up, read the messages, and set it face down again. 3 more came in within the hour. My aunt's husband, Raymond, who I had spoken to perhaps 8 times in my adult life, wrote that he hoped I would think about what this kind of conflict does to elderly parents. The phrasing was careful, the way phrasing gets when someone has been told how to write a message. A family friend who had known Renata since grade school sent a longer note, 2 paragraphs, about how grief can make people act in ways they wouldn't otherwise, and how perhaps we were all a little raw right now, and wasn't it worth stepping back. The 3rd message was from Renata's old college roommate, who I had met exactly once at the wedding, who told me she'd heard I'd been difficult and just wanted to reach out. One message used the word ungrateful. It came from my Aunt Carol in a follow-up text 20 minutes after the first. Renata has done a lot for this family too, Nora, and she feels you've been ungrateful of her trying to keep the peace. I read it 3 times. I put the phone face down. Something went still in my chest. Not anger, not yet, just the specific clarity that comes when a thing you half suspected gets confirmed in writing, by someone who doesn't realize they've confirmed it. My father was still at the table. He had not looked at his own phone once. They're calling it a misunderstanding, I said. He nodded. They would. Aunt Carol says I started it. He didn't respond to that. He just looked out the window. After a moment he said, Do you want more coffee? I said yes. He refilled both mugs and sat back down. The morning had stretched in the way mornings do when something shifts inside them. The light the same, the kitchen the same, but the weight of the air different. I thought about all the Sunday dinners I had organized when Renata stopped coming. The holidays I had adapted around. The hours in waiting rooms, the pharmacy calls, the unpaid week on his couch. I had never thought of those things as leverage. I had never wanted them to be leverage. But they were, apparently, a record. I kept my hands flat on the table and waited. After breakfast, I washed the dishes. I set each plate under the water and rinsed it clean. I dried the first plate with the blue dish towel that had hung on the oven handle for 3 years and set it on the counter. I dried the second plate and stacked it on the first. I set the mugs in the drying rack and wiped the rim of the second one where the coffee had dried on. I hung the towel back over the oven handle, straightening it by the edge until it lay even. I set the pan in the rack. I wiped down the counter with the cloth from the left side of the sink. I folded the cloth and set it back. I pulled out the chair and sat back down at the table. My hands were in my lap. The window was the same. The light was the same. My father went to the living room. He came back carrying the red 3-ring binder. He set it on the table between us. I was going to wait until after the new year, he said. But I think now is better. The binder had the word house written on the spine in black permanent marker. My father had made that label in 1987, the year he and my mother bought the property on Harwick's east side, a 3-bedroom with a detached garage and a backyard that had once had a garden. He sat across from me and opened the cover. I want to show you something, he said. He reached into the front sleeve of the binder, the clear plastic pocket on the inside cover, and took out a folded document. The paper was older, slightly yellowed at the fold lines, laminated sometime in the 1990s in the kind of thin laminate that bubbles at the corners eventually. He set it on the table. He unfolded it slowly, one crease at a time. I watched his hands. The tremor was not there today. His hands were steady in the way they got when he was purposeful, when he had made up his mind about something before the conversation began. Then he picked up his phone. He opened his email and navigated to a message from a name I recognized. Paul Detmer, the attorney he had used for estate matters since before I was old enough to know what an attorney was. He turned the phone toward me so I could read the subject line. Amended and restated trust, Gerald R. Caldwell, final execution copy. He set the phone flat on the table beside the laminated deed so both documents were visible at once. The house is assessed at $674,000, he said. The trust was finalized 8 weeks ago. Paul has the original. That, he touched the laminated document, is the 1987 deed, which I've kept because I like knowing where things started. I looked at both documents. My hands were in my lap. The trust names you as sole beneficiary, he said. The accounts, there's a savings account at Harwick First Federal, $14,830, also to you. The house, the contents, all of it. He said it the way he said everything, without theater, without waiting for a reaction. Dad. I've thought about this for a long time, he said. Not this morning. Long before this morning. He folded his hands on top of the binder. What Renata said on that phone call, she's been thinking that way for a while. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a direction. I didn't answer. I looked at the laminated deed, the county recorder's stamp at the bottom right, Gerald R. Caldwell and Margaret A. Caldwell, 1987, my mother's name in the same ink as my father's. The laminate had bubbled at one corner, just as he'd said it would. My mother had been dead for 11 years. Her name was still there, next to his, in handwriting that had not faded. You were here, he said. That's the whole of it. You were here. I looked at the deed and I looked at the phone screen showing Paul Detmer's email, and I looked at my father's hands, which were steady, which had the faint tremor only when he was tired. Something moved through my chest. Not relief, not vindication, not any emotion that had a clean edge, just a slow release of pressure, the way a door opens when you stop pushing against it from the wrong side. I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, Does Renata know? She will, he said. Paul will be in contact. Did you know she was going to do something like this? The call this morning. He was quiet for a moment. Not exactly, he said. But I knew the direction. I've known it for a while. He looked at the binder, then at me. That's why Paul and I moved when we did. 8 weeks ago. Not this morning. I took a breath and let it out. What if she contests it? Then Paul handles it, he said simply. That's what the trust is for. The structure is what it is. He paused. She won't. He said the last 2 words the way he said everything, not as reassurance, just as information, delivered by a man who had read the situation correctly and taken his time about it. He closed the binder. He pushed it across the table toward me. He picked up his coffee. He looked back out at the yard, at the patch of ground where the garden had been, and whatever he felt about all of it he kept in the quiet place where he kept things. He had left everything he spent 40 years building to the daughter who had shown up. Not as a punishment. As a record. When I finally spoke, I said the only thing that was true. Thank you for not making me ask. He nodded once. He drank his coffee. 7 months passed. Paul Detmer's office completed the trust transfer without incident. I signed documents at the Delwood County Courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon in March, the same week the first robin appeared in the backyard. My father moved into the apartment on Fenner Street with me for the winter. His idea, practical, easier for appointments, and then moved back to the family home in April when he decided the garden was going to be attempted again, in reduced form, starting with tomatoes. I helped him turn the soil on a Saturday morning in late April, both of us in the yard with the same pair of gardening gloves he had owned since before I was born. He planted 4 tomato starts in a row along the south fence. He watered them with the green hose coiled by the garage door and stood back and looked at them the way he looked at things he intended to stay with. I kept the red binder. It sits on the shelf above my desk now, spine out, the word house still legible in permanent marker after nearly 4 decades. Some evenings I run one finger along the label without thinking about it, the way you touch things that have been yours for so long the contact is automatic. Renata called once, in February. The call came in at 2:14 p.m. on a Sunday. I saw her name on the screen. I set the phone face down on the desk and let it ring through to voicemail. She did not leave a message. Marcus sent a text 3 days later. It said we should talk. For the family's sake. I read it. I did not reply. The family, as far as I could tell, was fine. My father had started his tomato seeds indoors in February, little plastic trays lined up on the kitchen windowsill, and he checked them every morning with the same attention he had once given to the robin. There are people who mistake proximity for entitlement, who believe that being related to something means being owed it, and there are people who confuse silence for surrender. My father had spent 68 years understanding the difference, and he had written that understanding into a legal document at Paul Detmer's office, and then he had made eggs and refilled his coffee and gone back to watching the yard. I kept the red binder on the shelf where I could see it. I kept the laminated deed inside it, folded at its original creases, my mother's name next to my father's in ink that had held for 37 years. That is what I have. That is what was left. If any part of this story found you in a moment when you needed to hear it, share it with someone who'd understand why silence is sometimes the clearest answer you can give.